Namaste, everyone, and welcome to the Bhakti Yoga podcast, where we share information on all things yoga, Ayurveda, and well-being lifestyle. I am excited to share these resources, insights, interviews, and so much more as we grow together on this wonderful journey of well-being. I am your host, Christina Andrini, founder of Bhakti Yoga Foundation and JBYU School of Yoga and Ayurveda. I'd like to invite you to subscribe to our blog on Tumblr, as well as to follow us on Instagram and YouTube and Facebook and all the fun social media channels where we share some of the tips and insights and resources from our podcast and vice versa on here. Now let's go ahead and begin with today's episode.
A continuation, wrapping up our series this week with the surviving the story within. And in doing so, we are working today on paradigms and how they block the freedom to enter into enlightenment. And we are going to be joined by guest Maria Colleen to really dive in to more and explore this experience that some of us struggle with accepting, okay? And Maria Colleen's background is with yoga and shamanism, health, and she's a mystical artist. She's provided gifts for practicing many different healing modalities, and she focuses on journeying back to the wholeness from the original spirit. And we open up this week with something she's contributed to this week's blog that will be posted later on this afternoon. And she speaks about, and this is to quote her, consider for a moment, so those of you that want to take a moment to just close your eyes here and listen to this comment that she wrote, consider for a moment if we are in fact healing atavistic ancient wounds. And I'm gonna definitely repeat that. So consider for a moment if we are in fact healing atavistic ancient wounds, and we take into account that trauma. And she kind of has a little quirk here that says any adaptation the body and DNA made to survive an overwhelming situation, and there's many, and it's true because there's many that we've adapted to. So this is stored in the genes, to continue, which are essentially coiled little information packets, and epigenetics says we can upregulate and downregulate this information. So just sit with that for a moment while I invite my girl on.
It literally felt like there was stuff that was uncoiling within my own DNA. That's the best way that I can say it. And what I saw was a bunch of starving people. And I was just like, I didn't understand why. I mean, I did actually. I sort of understood. I sort of pieced it together, and I've only pieced a lot of my experiences together with my own research. You know, I still haven't, I'm still piecing it together. But I saw a lot of starving people, and when I did a lot of research on that, I knew that both sides of my family had experienced starvation. That's actually why they left Ireland, was because they were starving. You know, there was the famine. And I think it was true with the Eastern European ancestry that I have as well. And so, and I think about that, how does that show up? How does that show up in our lives now? And I think about that as if you always have this sort of anxiety over lack, right? There's a lack and you don't understand, you have everything that you need, you think, but there's still this creeping sensation in you that's I'm not enough, I have a lack. It can really truly be traced back to, something that happened to your ancestors that they had to adapt, and then that changed the genes. Peter Levine talks about this, and there's a couple other trauma therapists that are really working into going into how our genes are changed, and then they kind of coil, right? They coil up. And sometimes our life experience will then unveil that stuff, because it's it's time to be healed now. Yeah. So That was what I saw. And then it was interesting. I went through a 2-year period of having an eating disorder because of stress and all sorts of, sometimes I wouldn't eat because I'm like, I don't have the money to eat, which is so silly, like I think I didn't have the money to eat. So I've been very blessed with people helping me in that regard. And I just wondered, like, I would go back and think, like, well, maybe that's something that's in the genes, because sometimes it's so beyond our rational ideas, right? It's beyond our rational understanding. So we really have to look back and understand, like, okay, this was a shift that happened within my genealogy that allowed my ancestors to adapt to whatever situation that they were going through. And now, it's not needed anymore, but we still have to like do the healing process and the recovery process of that. So, yeah.
I think this is really beautifully mentioned, because when you say about the coiling, it's like the Kundalini rising and rising into ourself again. And the symbolism behind starving people, like seeing starving people, but what are we starving for? The food is like our environment. It's what we're taking in. It's the nourishment. It's the support. It's the root chakra of the essence of our being, our intuition. And that nourishment is the lack thereof that we're starving for. And a lot of mental health is due to this isolation or feeling trapped or suffering in silence. And eating disorders emanate and permeate from this as well, this sense of self-talk or self-awareness of not feeling good enough or not feeling full enough or not feeling whole enough. And how can I be whole enough? Well, and Vata personalities are so irregular. They'll eat a bunch one day and then the next day forget to eat altogether because they're just, not hungry, right? So it's so, eating disorders can be really serious, like bulimia and anorexia. And we also have eating disorders in the sense of just an imbalance of our doshic constitutions, which then in turn create a starving sense within the self.
Right.
And that affects us wholly. It affects us in one entire chord. And when we come into this awareness, like you were talking about the Kundalini rising, about the uncoiling, and like you said earlier, you're still unveiling these different layers of yourself. You're the expert of yourself. And that is what constitutes you to speak your truths and to speak about atavistic wounds that you've held within because of your walk with trauma. No one's more of an expert than the person that's experiencing it from firsthand experience and being able to talk and teach from it. And that's where I admire you so much, because you come from a space of such wholeness and such integrity and courage to get on here into a platform to share yourself and be able to speak about these wounds that we've had and that beginning to rise up into the Kundalini that rises. This is, you said here, it would make sense then that we are uncoiling ancient DNA programs that must be a witness and healed for our survival as a species. We know the witness as the known, the knower, and the object of knowing, especially coming from the space of Ayurveda and from Maharishi. But from our own personal experiences, knowing what it is, the knower of it, and witnessing of the object of the known. And so could you explain or illustrate for us what that's like for you on your journey, how you are the witness and the observer, like the observer of the witness of the known object of knowing it?
Well, let's see. The first thing that comes to mind is two things. Mm-hmm. Like yesterday, I'll just explain a little bit first. Yesterday, I was very much alone. I've been alone a lot, and it gets to you after a while. You start to go a little batty, and I'm sure that people can understand that.
Yeah.
And what I found myself going down because all of these memories of certain traumatic events, and I've had a lot of really unsavory traumatic events that I haven't even told very many people about. Not very many people know those those situations. And when we sort of, the first thing I want to say before we're talking about being an observer is when we don't express them, or when we don't share them, we become in this, like, you know, like you said, like an isolated, like we become isolated into our own, it's like a feedback loop,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
Right? Feedback loop. And the two things that I heard recently in a really good trauma talk was that, like, doing spiritual work is really important. It's really important, and it gives context to an experience. But expression first, like being able to say, like become like in integrity with yourself. That's so important. It's like, yes, it happened and this happened and this happened, and it's not playing. So the spiritual work that we do is sort of like, is something that comes after the actual confronting of, like, this is the reality, this is what has happened, these are the things that have happened, and not from a victim mindset, but just to acknowledge, right? And what I think the observer, your question is, the observer is the thing that's like, okay, I can step back and understand with a greater sense of compassion why you are acting this way, because all these other needs and all these other hungers and all these other things have not been, you know, they've not been given air. Like I said, like there have been traumas in my life that, and I don't tend to say that, like, mine are worse or better than anybody else. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that, you know, there are things that I've never talked about. And I think that for me, the observer comes in as a way to say, like anybody in that situation would feel the way that you do, and not just feel the way that you do, but, like, can you have a better understanding of why you're reacting the way that you're reacting, based on the fact that, like, you've suppressed everything, you know, or like whatever it is? Because a lot of the times when it comes to trauma and mental health stuff, we have so much shame around it, right? Like, we have so much shame around it, or I'm not better yet, or whatever. And sometimes, like, for me, the only person that I can talk to is the higher self that's observing the situation, right? And being like, okay, you know, like there is a way that we can make sense out of all of this. And you having the courage to be able to speak about it. And I'm able to speak about it now. Maybe a year ago I wasn't able to speak about it, but now I'm able to speak about it and say, like, yeah, I've had some pretty intense things. And the thing that keeps me, I don't know, stable enough is that, you know, first, that the Creator hasn't given us more than we can handle, and that there's tools that are available and there's people that are available, and finding those things is important, but also becoming your own best friend, right? Like, becoming your own friend and saying, like, my darling honey, like, I've been observing you for a while, and, you know, you deserve more than this, and I want to give you more than that. And then going into a space where we can allow that to be. And because when it comes to mental health and trauma stuff, like, trust is sometimes really broken, right? And with ourselves, that's actually something I wanted to add to what you were saying about how, like, we maybe, like, the sense of abandonment. Because when I think of anorexia, I think of self-abandonment. I don't think of, like, oh, I have weight issue problems. That's anybody that I've ever encountered that has eating disorders is not like what we have learned in mental health things is like, oh, they have an issue with the weight. It's like, no, I think that it's actually a self-abandonment kind of thing. And in that way, that's sort of an atavistic thing, because I think that can go back really far. Like, you know, where did we have to cut corners and abandon our own souls in a way, our own wills, in order to get along, right? Like, in order to just be present in the world that we're in. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question at all. I'm kind of all over the place today.
That's okay. But you're witnessing that what the point is that it's self-abandonment.
Yeah.
And being aware of this space, being aware that you're abandoning yourself, being aware of the outcome of abandonment. Right. Being aware of what you're doing to nourish that abandonment. We seek outside ourselves most of the time, you know. And then when we seek within ourselves is when we become more aware of it. And it takes time. It's not every single day that we are, when we come face to face with trauma, when we come face to face with things that happen and create a disorder or an imbalance or a shock to the system, it just happened like a few minutes ago. There was a loud crash in the background that I couldn't hear you, loses our train of thought, right? And that same effect also happens on us daily, every day, right? We are on the flow, we're doing great, everything is wonderful, highlight rainbows and unicorns, and then something shocks us or abruptly creates a wall or a trigger happens, and then everything just went downhill from there. It went down. And then it's hard to climb back up sometimes because it keeps you down, because it shifts the entire physiology at this point, right? Everything just goes along with it, right? And then you're like, oh, now it's not going to be X, Y, Z, and this happened, and then this, and then this, and then the stories start, right? Then the stories start, and we continue with the story, and then we believe the story. And then after it's all said and done, we're stuck with the story. But are we observing that the story is just that, or are we giving too much value to a story we created based on something that triggered us? And so where is the balance? How do we find that? And that's where the witness comes in, is being able, and Brett Larkin talks about this as the positions of empowerment. And she utilizes it in her coaching, but she also utilizes it as a way for us to self-reflect. And it's like a trifecta. So you're thinking of a triangle, and you make 3 sheets of paper, and you write one, you write the self. One, you write the thing, the object. And then the other one, you write other. And then in the middle of that is the spirit. You physically have to put these papers down on the floor in a triangle, and then the spirit in the middle. You physically have to walk to each one when you're having the conversation. So when something comes up for you, and say it's, I am getting triggered. You said the word I, so that means it's the self box. So you go to the self box. I feel this way. I XYZ. I, this happened to me. All of the self-referral is in the self box. Now, the observer would be you, right? It would be someone looking at you from the outside. So you walk over to the observer, or you walk over to the object, right? Or you walk over to the thing of which is causing you whatever, right? Those are your options. If you're in the outside looking in, the witness, you're going to speak about it as, well, Maria, this is what I see happen between you and object. This is what I see. And you speak about it from the space of the observer. This is what happened, and this is what happened. Right? Now you walk over to the object or the person or whatever, and you speak from that perspective to you and to the witness, to the observer. Then you sit with it in the middle with the spirit. What would the spirit say? What would the spirit guide you to do? Right? And there you discover the compassion within yourself. And this is a huge, huge way to really break boundaries within the self, really discover, because you begin to take yourself out of the situation physically, utilizing this little project, and you begin to see the emotional, the physical, and the spiritual, which takes us to our next point from the witness is truth, freedom, and acceptance. Something that you illustrated in your commentary was that the pebble in the ocean is that information, and it is emotional. We talk to therapists, we eat chocolate, we invoke the heart. That's Vata Pitta Kapha, right? Each one has their own trait. It is physical because we learn why our bodies are the way they are with doctors, with embodiment practices, etc. And it is spiritual because it allows us to go beyond the rational mind, shamanistic practices, and really any artistic creative endeavor, dancing, singing, laughing, dreaming, that gives us the permission to sense the ultimate truth, freedom, and acceptance. And with that is your emotional, physical, and spiritual balance. The emotional would be more of the truth. It's hard to digest and process truth. It's hard to accept truth sometimes. Very, especially Pitta. Pitta is hard. They love to give truth, but boy, you give them truth back, right? Pitta personalities don't like that. So it's real hard. And then physical is the freedom. It's the feeling of liberation. That physical sense of not feeling that you're in a cage anymore, right? And then spiritual is the acceptance, right? And these two can go interchangeable. Actually, all three can be interchangeable. But spiritual is the acceptance of all things as they are, the wholeness of everything. That there is no what was, what could have been. It just is. And that's the acceptance. How have you experienced these three: truth, acceptance, freedom in your life? And has it been through the art that you share with us? And how are you working through and with it now?
Good question. Yeah, I'm coming back to being an artist again. And actually, I'm coming back to being an artist that I haven't been in a while, which is like performing. Because I've always been too afraid to perform. Like I do visual art as well, but performing and expression and singing and dancing, those have always, just these ways that sort of like the spirit comes and it's able to, how do I say this? It's sort of like we have freedom in those ways because we're able to go outside of our story for that moment, right? And I wanted to bring up like where we are collectively because in relation to the story, because I think it's really fascinating that because of everything that's going on, we are sort of inundated with this idea that like this is how things are and this is the state of the world right now, and there's all of this insanity going on, and in some ways it makes us so that we can't dream of another story. But I think that that's what we're doing now. Like I really believe that's what we're doing now. And when you talk about truth, that's what I said earlier, when it comes to like, in order to find the freedom, in order to feel the freedom, you have to be truthful with yourself. And that's actually something that, in my family, like we tend to sort of just put things under the rug. It's like there's and God bless her, like we don't really talk about stuff that's uncomfortable. We don't really work around that stuff. So, but I find that when you're able to really truly get into the nitty gritty of your truth, and the thing that keeps coming up that I want to share is like, I was assaulted by the cops in my room once last year, even pre-pandemic. Like it was a mental health call, and I don't need to tell the whole story because I think it's just really sad, but like I was on the phone and they wanted to send a team pretty much to like come and help me because I really just felt haunted for a while, and I don't know where that stuff came from. I'm still discovering that. I mean, I think it was in my DNA, but also like we talked about last, is that puncture our auric field. Like there's bad spirits, and sometimes the lighter you are, the more you attract that stuff. Just FYI for anybody else really struggling. The more truth you are, it's like, no, we want to keep the truth silent. So we're just going to, So I made a call to like a mental health, like a phone line, and they put me on a warm line with someone. And I talked for an hour. And by the end of the conversation, I was really exhausted. I was like, I don't want to talk to anybody else. So I asked them to cancel the team. I ended up canceling the team. Please don't come. And they came anyway, which I felt like what was really not fair because I had asked. I was like, please don't come. Like, I'm really tired. I just want to go to sleep. And when I asked them to leave, half an hour later, the cops showed up. And I won't get into all the nitty gritty detail of like what happened, but pretty much like I was handcuffed and taken out of my house after being like thrown to the floor, and my whole body was like, the adrenaline and everything, it just went like, I snapped like that out of being depressed. I wasn't depressed anymore. I was really angry. And, I never really talked about it. I never really talked about how on so many levels it was such a violation. And when we come about the truth, it's like, who do I even go and talk to about this? I didn't feel like my parents were even really being very supportive in that situation. I had bruises on my body and stuff. And then when the George Floyd thing happened, I was like, well, no one's going to want to listen. This is my story. No one's going to want to listen to, you know, a white girl talk about how she was also violated by the cops, you know, and it was violent. It was not a pretty, you know, a pretty situation. I would never wish that on anybody. But what it made me think about is how often when we talk about truth, like when we talk about the things that we hide, because we talked about this last week too, especially when it comes to mental health stuff, like how many other people are hiding with these shameful stories, right? And when we're able to actually talk about it, and we're actually, you know, like, we're able to like address it and just say like, I'm stepping into this without shame. That's where you find the freedom. Like you find freedom in that. And then the spirit is able to have space within you, right? It's able to like, oh, I can breathe. And then, you know, you take the practices that you love, especially for me, artistic practices that keep that spirit sort of housed in a space of, it's like, it's a space of I guess of freedom. It's like, you know, like you're allowed here. There's space for you here. There's space for all of your truth. Okay. And only when there's space for all of your truth can we feel that freedom and that acceptance, right? But as long as we're not actually addressing, like, what are the real truths that are going on when it comes to mental health stuff? And, like, I know that there's probably tons of stories of people, you know, when we think about, like, what does this mean? Well, in the future, let's not send cops to somebody's house, you know, or let's have cops have better training when it comes to dealing with mental health issues. So we all need to be more educated when it comes to what really is mental health and how do we actually address things so that we can find that sense of freedom. Because if we're just holding on to it, it's constrictive and it prohibits spirit to flow. And I think prohibits us from accepting ourselves, you know? So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your story, because that's really powerful. And what an experience. I'm so sorry. And this also comes back to paradigms, you know, breaking through these belief systems, you know, and within ourselves, and then also within teams such as those responding, giving them the tools that they need to be more aware of certain behaviors or behavior traits or patterns that are not necessarily something to reprimand in such a violent way, but more of a way for them to address it in a more compassionate way. And maybe this is an opportunity for our first responders to also learn that they are so stuck also in their own paradigm of everyone being a certain type of stereotype for the most part, and they tend to stay within that stereotype for the most part, and it becomes conditioned over time with them. And the same thing with even profiling cars, you know, who they're going to pull over, right? And we tend to forget that we need to break through those things. Enlightenment is taking the time to recognize the light within ourselves and finding that compassion to address others and not disrespect in any way. And it is disrespectful when you are in the middle of something and someone interrupts it in a way that it's like, well, you know this already. Why should I, you know, like, but we don't know this, you know, because they're not aware, right? We think that they know, but they don't know. And so when we come into paradigms, we come into blindness because it's like they're looking through blinders on the side and they know there's more to it, but they're so focused on like what this is right now in front. And so when we come into the space of enlightening ourselves, it's coming into the space of becoming more aware. And that's really what it comes down to. We have a lot of lack of awareness based on where we're at right now because there's so much going on and because we're so clouded or foggy that everything is everywhere. Everything is floating everywhere. And how do we come back to that truth and that acceptance and that freedom? How do we come back to that if we're so stuck in what we think should be, but not being open to what could be, right?
And I want to say that I totally agree. And I think that, what I've come to is that like you have to validate your own story. It doesn't matter how wild or crazy or like the insane, like you have to be like, okay, like I validate that this happened, and I validate and I accept how I feel about it, and I accept the fact that it wasn't addressed is what created the stories and created the blinders and, you know, all of those things. And, you know, just to touch upon like the polyvagal theory, because I think it's really fascinating when it comes to trauma and stuff. Because when we activate our vagus nerve, which is like, you know, the vagus nerve is one of the biggest nerves that come from the occipital bone, the base of the skull, and it runs through all of our organs, right? And so there's two interesting things that I've learned. You can have dorsal vagal shutdown, which means that like you literally freeze. You know, you're frozen, and it's actually like a biological thing. So we tend to believe that like all of this mental health stuff is just in our heads, and a lot of it is. I mean, a lot of the stories are, but we can shift the stories. And once we understand some of the roots about it, like it's actually my body responding to things that have happened, and that's kind of that observer role that you were talking about. Is like if we can just look at it like that, oh, my body's actually responding normally to an abnormal situation. And then there's the vagus nerve, which is the one in front, and it runs through the gut, and it runs like through the heart and the gut and all that stuff. And it's on a spiritual level, it's also connected to compassion, because when we are able to instigate the vagus nerve, it allows the body to like open and to be calm, you know, and to release all of that, because that's what happens. We're like this, right? And we don't even know we're like that. Like I'm still uncoiling that when it comes to like, so, and I think that that's really kind of cool, because that's like this really beautiful connection between spirit, body, mind, right? It's not all separate like we think it is. It's not separate. And I think that like in my experience, when it comes to like how we deal with mental health, it's like we're not taking into account all of those things, right? We have a body, not just chemistry. It's actually like a physiological response to things. And then there's the spirit, and then there's the emotions, and they're actually all imprinted in parts of our body. And so, yeah, when you calm down the vagus nerve, it allows for that enlightenment. It allows for us to see beyond, you know, the little blinders that we have, which sometimes just come to protect us. Like sometimes that just comes because it was a way that we coped in the past, you know? And so not judging ourselves for that is like a really big first step.
You know, a lot of what you speak about with the vagus nerves and the dorsal vagal nerve also help to be expanded upon when we're practicing yoga. And it's a lot of the reason why we do yoga. It's a lot of the reason why we practice, we move physically the body, because the body is responding as well as reacting to what it's receiving. And it goes all the way back to what we began with, and that's starving. It's starving. It's nourished now. It's receiving its nourishment. It's getting fed, and it's getting fed exactly what it needs. And what it needs is going to be the reciprocation and then the response mechanism of what you feel in Shavasana or in Samadhi. And that's from the front and the back merging together, Ida and Pingala, Hatha and Hatha yoga, right? It's the combination of the sun and the moon, the yin and the yang, the balance of the feminine and masculine, all the shrotas, and the channels that navigate everything within ourselves. And when we get to the very end of our practice is when we have that freedom, that expansion, that release, and the truth, right? Sometimes we come out with, oh my God, I didn't even think about that. What a great solution, right? It's just that freedom. It's just that everything's flowing very, very passively, very, very energetically. And it gives you that sense of, wow, I'm reconnecting to this self-awareness, the sense of self. And it's enlivening the intelligence within. And as we go into that, it's how we attain enlightenment, right? It's going into that space of the light within, enlightening others by that light, and being able to encourage and teach, educate, implement, input, all of those things, infuse into each other as we grow on this journey. Yeah.
Yeah.
So beautiful. So last but definitely not least, I just wanted you to let us know where we can find you and how we can connect with you on our future journeys together as we grow.
Well, I'm always here on Instagram, and I'm on Facebook as Maria Colleen as well. And I'm in the process of making a store, which I'm excited about, but it's also been really hard to like kick my ass. I'll say that, and really truly like to kick my butt through my own perceived blocks, you know. I'm like, that's not true. So I'm working on making a store, and I feel like I'm restarting. I literally feel like I'm starting from the ground up right now. So I don't have a huge, like all these different presences online, but I do have Facebook and I do have Instagram, and I'm always down to chat about spirit and health and art and expression. And I'm learning to liberate myself again, and I have lots of ideas. So I think 2022 for me is going to be like, it's going to be like, screw it, I'm doing it anyway. I don't even, I'm just going to do it. And because you live and you learn and you realize that like you're living right now. So, you can either believe the story that keeps you stuck or change it. Absolutely. And I'm in the process of changing it, reinventing myself.
I think that's an ongoing journey for everyone, is that we're always in the process of evolution, always in the process of change.
Yeah.
And it's just, you're always a student, no matter how, even if you're a teacher, your teachers are the best students are the best teachers. So it just works that way. So happy to have you, and thank you so much for sharing your story and your journey with us. So.
Thank you all so much for participating in today's wonderful podcast. As always, it's such a joy and an honor to share in this space with all of you and hold the space together as a collective. I invite you to support my life's work on Teachable. For those of you that would like continuing education units, Teachable will be the go-to for your membership. I'm looking forward to growing together and meeting you all. Please be sure to follow me on Instagram and introduce yourself. I would love to follow you back, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for free classes that are posted weekly. Looking forward to our next chat together, and I'll see you online, in person, in an immersion, or on this podcast. See you soon. From my heart to yours, much love and namaste.